The AYANEO Pocket Air is Aya's first Android handheld in what is already a very competitive market. Will their different approach with a premium design and custom software be enough to warrant a buy? Find out in our full review. Inside the box we first have the AYANEO Pocket Air itself. We will take a closer look at it shortly. Inside the branded box is a USB Type-C cable. And in the packaging are some leaflets and a user guide which is in English. You may have noticed that no charger is included as standard. We will include one for your country when purchased from us. The AYANEO Pocket Air measures 8.8 by 3.5 by 0.6 inches and weighs 380 grams. The retro edition is available in just the one colour, which is a Famicom inspired red and white with some yellowed thumbstick caps which gives it an aged look. The 5.5 inch AMOLED touchscreen display has a resolution of 1920 by 1080. All of the nerdy stats are on screen to read. It does look great, really nice and bright colours that stand out. On the front we have the standard gaming controls with Hall sensor analogues. There's two additional buttons on the bottom right for bringing up the iSpace overlay. The top has shoulder and Hall sensor trigger buttons that are quite comfortable to use. There are two macro buttons just beside the shoulder buttons. On the right are volume buttons and a power button with built-in fingerprint sensor. The bottom has a covered slot where you put your nano SIM and micro SD card. Beside is a 3.5mm headphone port, followed by a USB Type-C port. With one of our USB hubs you can use it for HDMI output to a TV or monitor. Grab a NT8 or NH8 with NVMe storage today at DroiX.co.uk and DroiX.net. Powering the AYANEO Pocket Air is a MediaTek Dimensity 1200, the same processor found on the GPD XP Plus handheld. There's a choice of 6GB 128GB, 8GB 256 and 12GB 512GB of LPDDR5 RAM and storage. For communications there is Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2, and not forgetting 4G mobile data with the nano SIM. The 7350 mAh rechargeable battery in our tests running Antutu on the loop got us around 3 hours. Times will vary depending on what software you are using. There is a built-in fan which has two settings, balanced and max. The max fan noise was around 70 decibels, but in most cases you can leave it on balanced at around 60 decibels and it should be fine. We also measured the temperatures whilst testing the battery life and got a highest temperature of just 34 degrees with the balanced fan settings. Very cool. The AYANEO Pocket Air runs on Android 12. It's not the latest, what with Android 14 rolling out, but it is fairly up to date. The front end uses Aya's own home software, which is quite nice to use. You have a shortcut to their iSpace front end and space to add regularly used apps. Scrolling up will bring up the full list of apps like you would get on an Android phone. You get a fairly bare bones Android setup with just the usual apps such as Google Play Store, File Manager, etc. You will need to install any apps such as games and emulators yourself. You can get them from the Google Play and APK Pure stores or download them manually. The iSpace launcher allows you to input your Pegasus and emulation station setups if you have one. We didn't have these setups so didn't bother trying it, but it's probably useful if you do. But you can simply copy your ROMs to the Pocket Games folder on the internal storage and they will show up there. Pressing the iSpace button on the device will bring up a useful overlay for information and shortcuts to common settings. There is no screen mapping tool, which is an absolute must-have for these Android handhelds. Even the low-cost handhelds usually have this. Apparently it will be added at a later date, whenever that will be. As this is an Android OS, we will run some benchmarks and compare the performance with other Android-based devices. Starting with 3D Mark and the Slingshot benchmark. It maxed out, which is a good sign. We have only just started doing benchmarks for Wildlife Extreme, so do not have much comparison data, but you can see that AYANEO Odin 2 is over double the score. It's also nearly 10 times faster than the recently reviewed Retroid Pocket 2S. On the Geekbench single and multi-core scores, we have better comparison data. We can see the score of 891 is double that of the Tiger T618 based devices, such as the Retroid Pocket Flip. It is also faster than the GPD XP Plus, which has the same CPU but LPDDR4X RAM. The LPDDR5 RAM provides a decent boost in performance. For the ANTUTU benchmarks, we get great scores. It's a fair bit higher than the GPD XP Plus, but not a patch on the mighty Odin 2. For this processor, it is a good score, but we will have to consider price versus performance later. Due to the lack of screen mapping, we were not able to try our usual Android games such as Call of Duty Mobile. So we downloaded a few other games that have controller support and not require screen mapping. You should not have any issues playing games, though you will of course need to use the touchscreen controls. It's not a big deal, but it is more enjoyable with a controller. Instead of playing with controller, I remembered Horizon Chase supports gyro controls, so here is some footage controlling it this way. It takes a little getting used to, but does work great. And now onto the emulator performance tests. We won't go into detail on 8 and 16-bit systems through to the PS1 and Dreamcast era, as they will all run perfectly fine. In most cases you can upscale the rendering to 1080p and have filters etc enabled, with no issues at all. We will show some classic console gameplay footage later in our final thoughts part. For now, we will take a closer look at the consoles around and after the PlayStation 1 era. For the Dolphin emulator, there is good overall performance. We tried a bunch of games on both of the systems that the emulator supports. Now and again there will be some dips below 30 or 60 FPS, but nothing that spoiled the games too much. This applies for both systems the emulator supports. The dual screen emulator Desmumu works perfectly. With the touchscreen you can play the majority of games with no issues. You can of course have both screens or a single screen visible whilst playing it by changing in the settings. The PlayStation emulator PPSSPP runs amazingly well. We are upscaling up to 1080p and have various graphics improvements enabled, along with 16 times anisotropic filtering. We got a rock solid 60 FPS on God of War, so that's good enough for us. For the Citra emulator on Sonic Generations, we do see the usual shader caching slowdowns we come to expect. The performance is vastly improved when there is no shader caching or lowering the rendering resolution. For other, less demanding games, the experience is far smoother with fairly solid frame rates. With Ether SX2 we do see mixed performance. With my personal go-to game Outrun, we see good overall frame rates with some dips now and again when the disc is being accessed. With Gran Turismo 3 we see regular frame drops below 60. You can speed things up a bit by lowering the rendering resolution if you wanted to. The Vita emulator looks like it works well. We got mostly 60 FPS, with a few minor drops below on our go-to game Street Fighter vs Tekken. We haven't tried a massive number of games on this emulator as compatibility is not amazing, but the ones that did work all were very playable. For Yuzu, we are getting around half the performance we need for full speed on Cruising Blast. Lower demanding games will work better, but for most first party titles you won't have much luck on them being playable. The AYANEO Pocket Air is a nice device let down by a few things. ISpace transforms the Android OS into something more similar to a gaming handheld, but it does feel a bit unfinished in places, especially the lack of screen mapping support, though do remember this is coming at a later date. The performance of the AYANEO Pocket Air is an important factor to consider. We did see great scores when compared to the GPD XP Plus, which used the same processor but slower RAM. Do consider that XP Plus came out 2 years ago. Compared to the AYANEO Odin 2, we see that this has around double the performance. Both devices launch around the same time and at similar price ranges. The Pocket Air is not great for price versus performance when compared. But for your money you do get a great looking Android based handheld with classic retro design that feels very comfortable to play on. The ISpace software when finished is an excellent addition, giving it a more premium look and feel. Let us know what you think of the AYANEO Pocket Air in the comments. And don't forget, you can order yours from us at DroiX.co.uk and DroiX.net for international shipping. That wraps up our AYANEO Pocket Air review. We hope you have found it useful. Please do take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you have not already. Thanks for watching, and we will see you back in the next one.